Jai Guru, everyone.
Tagore.
Hello, welcome to the Yogananda podcast, Autobiography of a Yogi line by line. Today we're doing chapter 8, part 5, and this is the last part of this chapter. You may be pleased to know because it's very scientific, but also the chapters coming are something very much I'm sure people are looking forward to as well. So we're with the usual crowd, but thankfully it's a full suite today. How's Mike doing today?
Very well. I was actually not supposed to be here today, but somehow life happened, and now I'm here.
Oh, I thought you meant by birth you're not supposed to be here. Like none of us are supposed to be here. Are we? You're supposed to be in the
Wow, yeah. Okay.
heavenly planes.
You're also right with that, Brian. Yeah.
And Lauren, how are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you.
Good. And Chris is somewhere in Portugal again, aren't you, Chris? Muted.
Sorry, friends. Yeah, chatting away to myself there. I was landed into Porto, Portugal just the other night. So I wonder, do we have any listeners in Porto? Say hi. If we do, I'm going to be here for a couple months. Nice.
Very nice. Well, meet Chris at one of the coffee shops in Porto. I'm sure he'll be happy to meet you.
Yeah. I think we actually have a SRF group in Porto. I reached out to you by email, but so far.
Even better. Meet Chris at the Self-Realized Fellowship Meditation. Best type of communion.
Exactly.
So, worldwide acclaim is the first section of this chapter. Sorry, not chapter, this part that we're doing. So we're starting with years later. Bose's findings were basically recognized worldwide and further substantiated. And it should obviously come to no surprise to us in hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, what ground-breaking work it was. And then in this autobiography section, he goes on to quote various scientists from Columbia universities and the experiments they did. But I was reading Shakespeare play Macbeth recently, and as you may or may not know, there's rumors that Guruji was Shakespeare, and his writing, both in the Shakespeare's most famous plays, ones that are confirmed to be written by Shakespeare, and Guruji's writings in the books that we know, you would certainly suggest that that's got to have some truth to it. But in the play Macbeth, I was reading a certain section about Lady Macbeth and how she kind of suppresses her guilt, and through that she sees she has visions, and then she gets nightmares, and then that kind of thing. So the analysis for that says that Shakespeare was basically describing in the play the impact of repressed emotions and guilt, and how that manifests and leads essentially to insanity. And this is hundreds of years before the actual psychological research actually took place. So it's funny that in here we're talking about Bose, as scientists essentially for the future, and influencing various works, but equally Shakespeare in his writing of a seemingly innocuous, entertaining play such as Macbeth, suspense-filled, but it also seems to have had influence in the scientific arena, in the psychiatry research. So I thought that was pretty cool, and I was reading that as I was reading this, so I thought that was a good parallel for me. But the Columbia University, essentially what they... Oh, Mike, please.
I wonder if that's a role you want to be in, that this kind of person that is ahead of its time. You bring all those ideas, you kind of know instinctively you're right, and everyone tells you you're wrong. And then you pass away, and then 50 years later, people are, oh yeah, this guy, he was actually pretty smart. Yeah. There must be either, I don't know if it is depressing or if it is actually nice, because people give you space and time. You can put the best work out and know that one day maybe it will be picked up by someone.
It's certainly a big cliche, isn't it, in analysis of prominent figures in history. that people use.
I keep thinking of Mozart, who was during his lifetime, he died a poor man. He was buried in a mass grave, and now everybody's talking about him like he's the greatest musician ever, right? But it's really the fame that didn't come to him. I wonder if that's something that will manifest in the next incarnation as
Gotta love Mozart. Gotta love his first name was certainly ahead of its time, wasn't it? It's a name that.
You mean Amadeus? Or...
Oh, second name then. Wolfgang. Is Wolfgang his second name then?
Yeah, it's Wolfgang Amadeus. Yeah.
First name. Yeah, that's a cool name that the youth of today would love to have. But in English, what does it mean in German? Is it German?
No,
Wolfgang.
I don't think it has a meaning.
Not a gang of wolves then. As the English would suggest. So going back to the autobiography, so the Columbia University and the research that was published by the New York Times suggests that essentially that the nervous systems, that we know today, that the research was being undertaken then, and it essentially influenced everything up to now. These are like electrical impulses in nerves. That's knowledge that we take for granted right now, and but obviously back then that's not knowledge that was taken for granted. It was groundbreaking stuff, wasn't it? The other thing I was going to say was that this is also one area where the Bose's instruments and his hypotheses on various things really had such a big influence in the field of medicine, isn't it, Mike?
Yeah, that just reminds me that how far we have come in technology. I have a friend here who is leading a lab, and she's a neuroscientist, and she has put all of machines on people's heads, and then you can clearly see when you move your body, the line, that the graph that is created by those machines like changes based on your movement. And so we can basically measure all those brain waves now, and back then we were denying that any of it was going on, and that's barely 100 years ago, right?
Indeed. You got some cool educated people in the know, Mike. Should bring them on to discuss some of this stuff. They'll be more qualified than us to talk about this.
That's true for sure. Yeah.
But we represent 99.9% of the readers, which is why who are equally unqualified to talk about this. But we read it and enjoy it all the same. So he was saying that essentially until these instruments that Bose was using for all these things, testing on plants, essentially there was no way to measure such fast moving electrical impulses, and the amplification of those signals are essential to the understanding of what that research and what those findings were in neurology and neurosciences. And then we have a very interesting parallel. So then Doctors Cole and Curtis essentially found that freshwater plant Nightella had, as is used in goldfish bowls around the world. Actually, not around the world. Actually, goldfishes, not everyone has around the world. India, we don't have goldfishes as pets. I always thought it was crazy. I actually distinctly remember when as a youth, my friend said, "I've got a goldfish." Yeah, and it was Mike.
I didn't know that until recently, but I was recently at a Persian New Year's celebration, and at the Nowruz, right? They put like this table and they put all those sweets and flowers and decorate it. And what I didn't know that until recently is that one part of it is also a bowl of goldfish. That's like the tradition. And so at my sister's house, they had Nowruz, and the goldfish are still there. There's a bowl of goldfish there now, and I find it so funny that they're still alive and they're still doing well.
So not goldfish to snack on. This is to look at, is it?
To look, yeah, live goldfish. Yeah.
Oh, good. Gives me some some relief. But goldfish, sorry, the Persians very much do know how to celebrate their cultural pastimes. They're very patriotic about their New Year celebrations, and yeah, it's very nice to have Persian friends to celebrate with them. They're very hospitable, aren't they? Yeah, so these essentially they found that the fibers inside this Nightella plant are exactly the same, essentially, as the fibers and the electrical signals are that are in nerves. The only difference being that the velocity is much slower than in mammals, essentially. But the fact that they're slower meant that they can use those and measure those and then deduce some findings from that. Essentially, you wouldn't be able to do that with mammals because they didn't have the technology at that time to to measure that. So that's pretty cool that they used that method of research to deduce one thing from the other. So I will say right now you'd kind of half challenge. Well, I would half challenge this because research now, like there's a very popular show on BBC right now, David Attenborough, which I'm sure the majority of our listeners will have heard of. But if you haven't, he's this very famous biologist, scientist, in England, and he's become world famous. Not just because of the research he was doing, but also because of his lovely, seasoned voice, which is almost like God designed it for this very purpose of describing nature and all its intricacies. But he was in the show. There's a recent show called The British Isles, and the paradigm was, most people think there's not much to see in Britain. It's a random island in the middle of Northern Europe where not much happens wildlife wise. But this show really challenges that. And one of the things that they show about, there's a specific episode about trees. Lauren, would you like to read out what's in this specific episode?
It says, autumn brings fungi, and we travel underground to see how a subterranean network of fungi, known as the Wood Wide Web, connects the whole forest together, passing vital nutrients and information between trees, supporting new trees and healing damaged ones as required. So
if you can imagine, like there's this thing called a neural network. If you can imagine like a brain and the synapses of the brain, like and you being able to visualize the electrical signals moving in the various parts of the nervous system, imagine that magnified 100-fold, and actually using the fungal networks, because underground there's all sorts of fungi that we can't see. Like I think apparently under your lawn it's built on fungus, and if it wasn't there then your lawn wouldn't grow. So essentially in forests there's a similar thing, and this episode was showing that not only is the fungus used to revivify dead and make organic matter, but also as a means of communication and passing energy in between the whole of the forest and the network of trees. So if, for example, there's a downed tree or a broken branch, or, for example, one of the trees wasn't getting much water, what happens is it draws in that energy and that nutrition from the healthy trees, and then they collectively give it to the weaker tree. So, and this is all happening like really beautifully and really like cohesively. So it's a really advanced system of organic matter that you'd think is independent, but is actually very connected and essential for the survival of the whole forest, because each one depends on each other. So it's really nice, and I wonder how much Bose's research influenced that avenue of research. We would never know. So yeah, that's quite cool. So then it also says that the Nutella plant then may be considered as a Rosetta Stone. for unveiling all the secrets in between the realms of mind and matter. And Rosetta Stone, Mike, what is a Rosetta Stone?
Well, it's now used as a metaphor for something that can translate, but it's a stone. I'm speaking now from like what I learned in school. It has like the same text written on it in 3 different languages, right? And that's how certain languages were deciphered.
Yeah,
And
specifically
where is it now, Priyank?
hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics, is that how you say it? The Rosetta Stone was key to actually working out how to read hieroglyphics. So it's Mike. To answer your question, it's in. I didn't know, but you reminded me. It's in the British Museum. Should be
a safe place, right?
should be in a museum in Cairo, I imagine, but nope, it is in
one day
in Britain. Maybe. It's a gift to. I'll toe the British line, the Rishi Sunak line. It's a gift for humanity, no one particular civilization.
Thank you, Britain.
And if we hadn't preserved it so well, it would be in pieces, shattered. Anyway, the next section of the book is he essentially quotes the Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore. And Rabindranath Tagore is India's very famous poet and musician, and he comes from a long line of accomplished family members, and we're going to read and hear all about him in a chapter dedicated to Tagore, and he's got his own school, and Guruji goes and visits him, so that's to come later. So we won't dwell too much on Tagore, but he is a very eminent figure in Indian history and Indian literature and Indian music. And Mike?
And he was also Bengali, right? I feel like at this time there was a lot going on in Bengal, not only Yogananda, but also people like Tagore and Jagadish Chandra Bose. It was like a hotspot for new ideas and groundbreaking movements.
Yeah, it's actually insane to think about that. So many greats were in that same space. And I was just speaking to my wife about this because we'll talk about it a bit later, but I'm reading the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa, and because the next chapter is about that a little bit. So I was reading that book, and it's obviously a breathtaking piece of work, and his life is breathtaking equally. And he was obviously around in 1860s and 70s, and a very, very important figure in the renaissance of Hinduism, actually, in that time. But he was there, and just down the road, Lahiri Mahashaya was there. And a bit further, Babaji was there, no doubt, just wandering around, and all these other saints, and like Tagore and Master Mahashaya, and all these figures steeped in the spiritual fabric of India are just there, and they would have crossed paths, and they would have breathed in the same air at some point and exhaled the same air, and they would have walked the same bit of soil somewhere, and some fortunate soul would have been blessed enough to take the soil of that hallowed ground with all those greats. Yeah, and that's just not even to name. That's just to name a couple that we know about, and there's countless others at that time that we won't go into. But the Tagore's poem, essentially is written this poem about the idealistic scientist, the ideal scientist, and it's a very sweet, very, very sweet poem. He starts by calling him "O hermit." Hermit is usually reserved for someone that's a spiritual recluse, eminent, but he's referring to him, a scientist, as a hermit. Mike?
I think every dedicated scientist can identify with this word permanent, right? You need to spend a lot of time in your lab or at home to just make some progress.
Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed. So he quotes the Sama, and he's quoting the Veda, Sama Ved, and we're going to talk about that in the next in about 10 minutes or so. But here we'll just focus on the poem. So essentially, he's referring. He's giving the most wonderful of shout outs by writing a poem about him. It's quite a privilege, I would say, to have India's most eminent poet write a poem about you, isn't it? And it's quite fitting that those two souls were so, such friendly relations, isn't it? Because their paths cross not only physically, but in the realms of metaphysics. And one maybe using literature and music, but the others using scientific discovery to essentially uncover the mysteries. Mike?
I wonder at what stage Tagore was in his career at this point, because the way I think you're gonna describe it, that was Tagore before receiving the Nobel Prize and after, and before he was didn't have a very high standing, and afterwards he suddenly was the star, and also in India. So I wonder if this maybe was written before, and then later on when he became so famous, he go like, oh my God, Tagore wrote a poem about me, even though it's the same person, right?
He was then ahead of his time.
Yeah, exactly.
Ahead of his time in his life. And it would have been cool if he wrote this before a scientist became very, very well known. That would be cool.
As well.
Bit prophetic, perhaps. I really like the rise awake in quotes. It's really, really quite impactful to me. But again, we'll cover the Samavid in more detail a bit later. So there's other elements here in this poem which we won't read verbatim, but if there's any lines that stick out, please do say. So there's a concept here where he says pedantic wranglings profitless, which to me rings to when people philosophize over what to do, what not to do, why to do it, rather than doing it. And that's getting caught up in theory rather than actual practice. And essentially that could be a very good description for experimental scientists such as Bose. So that's quite nice and quite a good lesson for us to stop our rambling and do. The other concept that's quite nice here is he's calling to the scholar band that he's sending, that Bose has been sending his timeless messages to, and the scholar band in this case is obviously the worldwide group of scientists, and all of them are united in their search for truth, be it in whichever field of research that they're in, or whatever country they're in, whatever their actions were, or whatever their purposes were. Like we had the space race a bit later than probably when this poem was written, but at first the first thing they wanted to do was get a satellite to orbit the Earth, and as soon as Sputnik did that, shudders down this American spine. But actually, scientists around the world would have been like, oh my God, imagine what we can do with a satellite, right? Regardless of its implications for military use, but the fact that what we can achieve. And then obviously then America landed on the moon, and equally there was fear, but there's in more than fear, it was the realm of possibility of travel, interstellar travel. Mike?
Yeah, in retrospect, you would have to say that having the space race as a competition is entertaining and it's easy to digest, but actually the contributions were really great on both sides, you would have to say. And to this day, I read articles on this often because I'm just interested. And one planet that is really interesting is Venus, because it is the same size as Earth and it has many attributes that make it an interesting planet. And during the space race, the Soviets, they landed like multiple satellites on Venus. Neither of them survived very long because the conditions are very harsh there. But most of what we know about Venus today is from those missions. So I feel like science goes like, is it a universal thing, right? It's not a Russian or American or whatever thing, right?
And that's essentially the next line. Together around thy sacrifice of fire, let them all gather. And it is a sacrifice, isn't it? It's you mentioned earlier, it would be pretty lame being ahead of your time. You don't get any appreciation. You won't get any you won't get any reward. You'll have to just do it for the love of the game, knowing that some point in the future, that humanity's going to benefit. I think there's a nice quote that similar to this, that something like spirituality begins when a person plants the seed for a tree, knowing that he'll never ever enjoy the shade from which it transpires, because it's for future generations. And this is essentially what all the scientists around the world are doing, aren't they? In their fields, individual fields. So yes, homage, let us pay our respects and gratitude. So the next line is about really patriotism, and this is now Tagore being very patriotic, and Tagore was deeply patriotic, and that's probably one of the many reasons why Guruji included so much of his work and the chapter dedicated to him, because of their shared patriotism. But Tagore really goes to town on this. He's idealizing India to an infinite level, isn't he? Essentially saying that the lofty seat and platform and teacher of all lands, he calls it. So this is no passing compliment. This is not just someone who is is respected in India. Tagore's poetry and works to this day are glorified and studied across the world. So he's a very learned man, and for him to also be this patriotic and to refer to the Indian history and the contributions that it used to make and what it is not making now or then under the British rule must have been really painful for him. And actually it was painful to Indians as well, because the gap between what we can do and what we're allowed to do under the British rule are two very different paradigms. Like Tagore wrote a book which I read which was called The Home and the World, and he likens a marriage to what's happening with India right now. So he's there's this lady that's like in a very repressed kind of emotionally weird marriage, and then she's contemplating the idea of getting away from the marriage or finding someone new. And he was using this whole book just to compare the Indian mindset right now, where everyone's very used to the British, and even though it's got all these flaws, we're kind of invested there. And then but there's this pasture that's out there that so yeah, he does some beautiful work, just as Shakespeare did in weaving in bits of sentiment. Chris?
I actually used a very similar analogy when somebody asked me about why I don't eat meat. Yeah, imagine if somebody was in a bad relationship the whole time, they didn't realize it, and then afterward they kind of wake up to it. So yeah, it's fun.
Yes, indeed. So let's move on now to the footnote. And it is quite a footnote. Lauren.
Before we do, I'd also just love to highlight the fact that in this poem, he talks about meditation. It's so integral to India, and here we have like a really full picture. And he says, he's talking about India returning back to her natural state, and then he describes it to her trance of earnest meditation. Let her sit once more unruffled, greedless, strifeless, pure. And wow.
Really good affirmations, isn't it, for us just to sit whilst we're to stay whilst we're meditating. Strifeless. Imagine if we really took the strifeless to heart and really made that word our own during the infinite patience that's required to attain samadhi in meditation, or even out of meditation, because that's
unruffled.
Unruffled as well. Because we're beset by failures. Lauren, thank you for pointing that. I actually made a note on that, but I didn't say it. So well done.
There you go.
There you go, Lauren, in tune. But he says, to duty and devotion, to her trance of earnest meditation. And trance, remember, this is English word, but not a very good translation for the word samadhi. So to let her to duty and devotion, to her samadhi of earnest meditation, we could replace that word, and we would probably get a bit more joy from it. That would probably be Sabikalpa samadhi as well, maybe not Nirvikalpa. Footnote. So this is now an epic footnote. I'm troubled by how we should be dealing with this footnote, because if Guruji and SRF have thought it is so important to put such emphasis on this stuff, then who are we not to pay respect to all the stuff that's in here? So we'll go through it in some detail, but not a lot of detail. I've got some readings here and there that we'll go through as well, so listeners, do bear with us. So the first thing to note is that it's translated, the poem was translated by Manmohan Ghosh. Not the poem, actually. Was it a poem? The psalm, the psalm of it thing, the reference was translated by Manmohan Ghosh. So Manmohan Ghosh is the brother of Aurobindo. Aurobindo is this South Indian, very famous mystic from South India in Pondicherry, and he's got an ashram there, which is very lovely. French town there. They speak French, and and out of that community and out of that ashram, they've got something called Auroville, where they're doing this pure experiment of communal living without any currency, in the spirit of volunteering and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very interesting experiment and interesting community, and there's people all around the world that are living in it, and everyone's very it's been studied in sociology around the world, so that's quite interesting if people want to have a look at that. But this poem is, as I say, it's translated by Manmohan Ghosh, and it was published in Tagore's Santiniketan, which is the kind of society that his family established in Bengal, and this is probably a magazine. So this section of the footnote says that the hymn called Sama is one of the 4 Vedas. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But here he goes on to describe the importance of the Vedas and why, the origins of the words and the relation to Brahma. So you can read all of that. There's also a nice chant that is similar to that. There's that YSS chant is called Brahma Guru Jai, which is quite nice. They did that in, I think, last year's convocation when they do the kirtan from the Smriti Mandir in
Mm.
India. So yes, so then he's also saying that essentially the whole of the cosmos is represented in the Vedas, which is quite a thing to say, but it's actually verified. Not well, it's one thing for Indians to say that, but then
Mm.
there's various historians and philosophers that also say it. Victor Cousins is one of the historians that says it. He's a famous Indiologist, if that's the word. But Mike, what does he say? Do you want to read out the bold bit?
He says, when we read with attention the philosophical monuments of the Orient, above all those of India, we discover there are many a truth so profound that we are constrained to bend the knee before the philosophy of the East, and to see in this cradle of the human race the native land of the highest philosophy. So that was Victor Cousin. And then Friedrich Schlegel also made an observation. He said, even the loftiest philosophy of the Europeans, the idealism of reason, as set forth by the Greek philosophers, appears in comparison with the abundant life and vigor of Oriental idealism, like a feeble Promethean spark against the full flood of sunlight. So they were pretty impressed by the philosophy of the East, to say the least.
Indeed, really good quotes and respect given to those Vedas. And it is and he goes on to say it's an immense literature. And and another very interesting point that's next mentioned is that the texts don't ever mention, or no author is ever ascribed to them. One of the common things that is said is, Vyasa, who was the author of the Mahabharata, he's the one who authored the Vedas, but actually they're referenced in the Mahabharata, so it's before that. So essentially what the theory is that Veda Vyasa, which is what we call him, Veda Vyasa, is he kind of organized the Vedas, and not organizing them in terms of text, but actually in terms of how they should be structured, in terms of our understanding, what should be recited at which point. And because there was no text at the time, and one of the things this section of the footnote says is that the paper and stone are not great in terms of time, and also where they're kept, as we know with the Rosetta Stone. We've gone thousands of miles away from where it was installed. So, but what does last is essentially mantra, or the revelation by sound, which is what he mentions here in the footnote. And there's something called shruti, which is directly heard. So essentially it's passed down. This whole Veda, which is apparently 100,000 couplets, are passed down through chant and recitation, which is pretty amazing. And it's completely orally, and it's restricted to Brahmin priests. Well, it was restricted to Brahmin priests to hand over. So it'd be in their, generations, and that's why the Brahmins are considered high, because they've got they're the font of knowledge, because it's in their tradition to learn and memorize and to pass on to their children. But Chris, can you tell us how they would go about memorizing 100,000 couplets? It's as you described in this footnote.
Yes, the Vedas were a revelation by sound.
No, the second bit, the
second
bold.
part, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. By observing the particular order, Anupurvi, in which the Vedic words occur, and with the aid of the phonological rules for combinations and sounds, Sandhi, and for the relation of letters, Sanatana, and by providing in certain mathematical ways the accuracy of the memorized texts, the Brahmins have uniquely preserved from a dim antiquity the original purity of the Vedas. Each syllable, akshara, of a Vedic word is endowed with significance and efficacy.
Quite special, isn't it? So this is essentially how knowledge has been passed on untainted through the millennia in India's rich history. So this is absolutely fantastic, isn't it? And one thing that Bose did in his research was that he wanted to publish all the knowledge free, didn't he? He didn't want to put any patents in place, and he had this grandiose theory on the economics of knowledge and sharing of knowledge. And similarly, the Vedas, no one person owned them. The author didn't think to write his name down, right? And so the knowledge was freely distributed amongst the whole of the masses in India through qualified priests, essentially, such as Brahmins. So very interesting parallel there. And this is why Rabindranath Tagore, no doubt, would have held both in such high esteem, because this is the culture from which he knows a lot about as a literature enthusiast, and one of the renowned poets of our time and that time, and he obviously appreciated what Bose was doing and how he was doing it and the impact he was going to have on future generations, which is true. So we said that, and actually before this call, Lauren and I were discussing how to pronounce various of the words that we're gonna read out in a second, and I was describing the intricacies of various parts of the pronunciations, and they're very subtle, right, Lauren? But if you didn't have it precise, and here, what Chris read out just speaks to the preciseness of how it's conveyed, how each word, akshara or letter, is conveyed, then through time you'd get variations, and then it would get tainted. But because it's mathematically, each sound, consonant, vowel is mathematical, both in terms of where it comes from the mouth to the way it's said to the breath. It's all linked, so then it can't ever degenerate, which is the beauty of Sanskrit and why so many people are in love with the ancient language. So in India, we've obviously got tens of different languages, if not hundreds of variations, a lot of which are from Sanskrit. But so Sanskrit itself is there as the common thread that weaves all of them through scripture. So no one speaks the Sanskrit, as we mentioned previously, but a lot of people know it because of the scripture and the famous poems and the epics that are in Sanskrit. But the languages are all allowed to evolve as they do in all the other parts of the world. So that's the difference between the two ways of doing it. So it's an interesting parallel, actually, because is it King James, when he ordered the English translation of the Bible, and that became obviously one of the most important things for Christianity, really, wasn't it? To have that English translation. But so many people debate now the words, and now that we've got so many different Bibles and so many different interpretations, and the languages are very, very mixed up. And we had Professor Clooney in from Harvard University, who essentially was saying a similar thing. How from ancient Aramaic to present day English to Old English back then, it's all very, very muddled, and hence we can have so many different interpretations of seemingly the same same verse. But yeah, so let's talk a little bit now about the Vedas. Now, I've taken some things out of God Talks with Arjuna, which are of specific interest to us. So, Lauren, can you start us off about the Vedas?
Yes.
Comments. Yeah.
I would love to. And this is from chapter 2, 45.
Yeah.
Verse 45. Of the four Vedas, The Rig Veda is the oldest or original text. Its philosophy and prescriptions show an evolution from worship of the forces of nature to the recognition of one supreme spirit, Brahman, and correspondingly, evolution from dependence on the favors of the gods to self-mastery. The Yajurveda and Samaveda are considered generally to be derived from the Rig Veda. The Yajur is a special arrangement of rituals, a handbook for priests who conduct the ceremonial rites. The Samaveda contains selected chants and defines their proper melodic intonation as applicable to the Vedic rituals.
Yeah. So Yajurveda, essentially, you may have heard of the word tantra, and a lot of tantra then would derive from this book. But before you go on a mad quest to learn about tantra and all these other Vedas, please do listen to the rest of what the quotes here from what Guruji writes. There's a word of warning, essentially. Go on, Chris.
The Atharva Veda is of later origin and is primarily incantations, and magical formulas designed to appease negative forces and gain mundane favors. Among its practical prescriptions are those that have been called the beginning of Indian medical. Oh my gosh, sorry, it's slow today. Medical science. Sages who are able with divine intuition to read not the surface meanings, but the true essence of Vedic thought, declare these scriptures a timeless source of knowledge, touching on all secular as well as religious arts and sciences.
So it sounds very pagan-like, doesn't it? But there's some depth to it. Mike, if you'd like to carry on and elaborate on the depth.
The renowned Shankaracharya of Puri, His Holiness Jagat Guru Swami Sri Bharati Krishna Tirtha, found in 16 slokas of the Atharva Veda, the Ganita Sutras, which have been dismissed by many Western scholars as unintelligible nonsense. Oh my God. Unique formulas applicable to mathematics in all its branches, from simple arithmetic to calculus and physics, and all forms of applied mathematics. See Vedic mathematics written by Motilal Banarsi, 1965. In 1958, the head of the Govardhan Math in Puri and the direct spiritual successor of the 8th century Adi Shankara toured the United States under the auspices of SRF. During his 3-month tour, he spoke on Vedic metaphysics and mathematics in major universities across the country. It was a historic event, the first time any Shankaracharya had traveled to the West. Wow.
Indeed. So there's a lot of, if you interpret it a lot of it in the literal senses, you could get lost, and as the some Western scholars call it, unintelligible nonsense. You could deduce that, but then if you did that, you wouldn't come from the tradition and the history of knowing what its purpose is. And for example, all the mathematical deductions that Mike just read out there, you may not even be able to appreciate because you had that initial reservation because it's so different to how a Western scripture or a biblical scripture is. Mike?
Is it possible that those Western scholars who said this was nonsense didn't have the level of mathematics or physics themselves to understand what was actually being said in those, or maybe they weren't expecting this high amount of knowledge condensed in a small
Yep.
Text.
And also because of the various incantations and fire ceremonies, it does all seem very, witchcrafty and pagany and very old, in terms of its antiquity. And it's old in terms of it doesn't feel like a modern way to do stuff. But there is obviously a lot of metaphysics there that a simple scholar wouldn't appreciate, certainly not one from the West who's not from the Eastern tradition. So that is what you would deduce naturally if you were of Western, history or born in the West. The Gospel of Ramakrishna Paramahansa also talks about this in the book Master Mahashaya, and also talks about this essentially that all these all these rituals and these fire rites, they've got an ancient they've got a very deep and profound purpose that isn't essentially obvious just by looking at it, but the impact can be seen on the subtle levels. But we can get lost in all of that, and that there's obviously a very big risk that we do that. But the bug, if we go down that line, but the Bhagavad Gita is they call it, and Guruji calls it, the essence of the four Vedas, because it has virtually everything. It has the philosophy. If you look, it's actually got some rituals in there, and Guruji calls the rising Kundalini force as the Kriya as a real fire ceremony, and so he's literally in God Talks with Arjuna. He's taking various elements of the Vedas and then bringing it out in a way that we can appreciate. And even though it's 2,000 pages long, and that in itself is a study, it's obviously much easier to study the Bhagavad Gita than it would be to go to the Vedas. So Lauren, can you read out what Guruji says about that? Because the Gita, as we said, there's four Vedas, there's 108 Upanishads, and there's 6 other systems of Hindu philosophies, but Guruji here tells us what their significance is for us in God Talks with Arjuna, again in the same chapter and verse. Lauren, can you read that out?
A scripture is meant primarily for the liberation of the soul from the bondage of rebirth, and secondarily for teaching the art of success in material life. Certain classes of people blindly worship the Vedas and consider all of their injunctions to be observed literally as divine prescriptions essential to liberation. The authors of these ancient treatises were wise enough to stimulate interest in the scriptures by showing the general populace ways of material success, and then to try to lead them on to follow these self-disciplinary rules that end in spiritual liberation.
So it means different horses for different courses, and a roundabout way to essentially attain the same goal of self-mastery and self-realization. So the word of warning here is, unless you're an academic and you have scholarly inclinations about the history of literature and scripture, then Guruji is essentially telling us not to go down this rabbit hole of going down and studying all these ancient scriptures and books, because he's made it so easy for us, and even the easy path is not easy path, because God Talks with Arjuna is 2,000 pages, and the lessons are that long, and the second coming of Christ is that long. So we've got enough work, even with the condensed essence that what Guruji has given us. We've got enough work, but this is essentially where all of that essence is derived from, and Guruji wouldn't be Guruji if he didn't tell us where it all comes from. Laura?
And it's not just the reading, is it? It's then applying the reading to one's own realization. So you can, if reading it is and understanding it in the brain, that's one thing, but then actually realizing it, it's a whole other, isn't it? So,
and that's the goal, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Being a scholar is not the goal.
No. Mm,
As interesting as it is sometimes to be
indeed.
scholarly.
And good for your ego. Yeah.
Yes, being called a professor and what have you.
Mm.
Didn't
Scholar.
Yogananda not say, or somewhere in SRF not say, it's one of the more challenging, pursuits to be able to keep the ego, on track, not get too carried away. In paths of yoga, at least, when you go down the scientific path, can consume your mind.
Because you go like, I'm so intelligent, and yet I have to stay humble. Very difficult. Yeah.
So thus ends chapter 8. So my reflections on this chapter is that there was much more philosophy than I thought there would be. I thought it was quite heavily into the science, which obviously there is a lot of, but interwoven in virtually every other paragraph is this deep, profound philosophy and about the intrinsic nature of life and the creator's hand in everything, and also the the altruistic elements of economics, or the way to approach knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge and the importance of that, is something that was a really nice to reflect on during this little 5 weeks that we've spent on it, because we're really talking about the ideal approach, aren't we, to education and your career and work ethic and the perils of commercialization. Mike, sorry, Chris.
Yeah, it is an interesting one, isn't it? I agree with you, Frank. There's so much more philosophy in it, and I'm trying to cast my mind back to when I first read the book. I remember actually, this chapter. I remember where I was when I was reading through it. I remember just thinking to myself, like, wow, I'd grown up in the West. I'd never really had any appreciation for India's contribution in the scientific pursuit. And just going through it now, it just unravels that, or it compounds that, understanding, that realization of, the depths of contribution that India has had. So when I think maybe why Yogananda included this information for us to digest in the autobiography of a yogi, of all things, we've talked about it before, where it's kind of not really necessarily about him, is it? It's an autobiography of other yogis and of other peoples almost, than necessarily just about Yogananda. So it's just it's a really compounds the truth that Yogananda feels so passionately and has so much love for the peoples of India, the history, the contributions that India's had, and it probably is reaching out to the audience, isn't it, very gently, to kind of guide our attention over to where it helps build the bridge between the East and the West. And that's really what he was trying to do so often, was build the appreciation of what each side can bring, and this just says, okay, look, what you guys can do, we can do, and maybe even better at times. We actually have a lot in common. So it's just built that appreciation for me, going over this with a fine tooth comb.
Indeed. The other big element of this was the weaving in of the ancient India's great contribution to modern day, civilization, be they the ancient universities of Nalanda and Taxila University that is mentioned in this chapter, to modern day scientists, but also the scriptural references of the Vedas and their scientific approach in terms of knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge in those universities that we mentioned before, which is pretty cool. The other thing was that it was when the British came, they kind of, with their economic and military might, they suppressed that side of like the appreciation of Indian history amongst the Indians, because like as a dominated nation of peoples, and if your ruler is saying, look, the reason you're so backwards and the country's so poor is because, you know, all these ritualistic things that you're doing, all your scriptures are all, you know, not great, but we've got Jesus Christ and we've got the Bible, and this is look at what we can achieve. But this is really the importance of this is why I think the importance, why so much patriotism is in these interwoven into these chapters and sections, because the mentality and the culture in India, the morale must have been so low after 150 years of foreign rule, and it wasn't ideal rule. It wasn't an altruistic ruler, was it? It was essentially a ruler that was interested in the empire and taking wealth and making the British Isles as strong as possible, at the cost of the countries that it was ruling over. But we won't get into that. But it was quite tough to study this one. I'm sure all of you who prepared for these episodes will attest to that. But I think only when you study it in depth that we have, you can draw out all these beautiful arcs that we have from there. So I'm glad we did it, Mike.
I feel that when I read this chapter before, I glossed over a lot of things that I found too challenging to think about it at the time. That's why I'm actually really thankful we did this deep dive and we actually went through every single piece of footnotes in the chapter, because it is very scientific and you have to do some research to put some things into context, but it's actually the message of this chapter is great. So I'm glad to have had this experience.
Thank you, Mike. So looking ahead, so chapter 9. I'm gonna, Lauren, if you don't mind, I'll start, and then you can perhaps summarize what we've got to look forward to. So firstly, I'd say from here on in, it gets extremely serious. So Master Mahashaya, which Lauren is going to talk a little bit about, is obviously quite an exalted disciple of Ramakrishna Paramahansa, but the Guruji's experiences with him are quite profound. So I think this next chapter and then the following chapter is I meet my master Sri Yukteswar, and obviously it doesn't get much more serious than that chapter. So we're gonna have to really stay focused to do these coming chapters quite good justice, because we tried to split up this next chapter and we could get no less than 7 parts. So next chapter is going to be pretty immense. But one thing that you should do is that Master Mahashaya wrote a book for his guru, and it's a very famous book called The Gospel of Ramakrishna Paramahansa. And it's the reason it's famous because Master Mahashaya was essentially, he was with him for a large part of his life, and he kind of kept a diary, and this book is the diary of that. So it's quite nice, and from my perspective, there's a lot of devotion in the next chapter, and a lot of elements of Kriya practice, and how we should apply it as well. So it's a perfect next chapter, I think, or a perfect first of the very deep chapters to go into. But Lauren, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the start of the next chapter.
I mean, you've done it justice. We could have left it there. What I would say is that even though it's serious and deep, for me, it doesn't feel heavy. So I hope our listeners are not put off by our 7-part chapter for chapter 9, because I don't think it will be heavy. But yes, we start chapter 9 with him meeting Master Mahashaya, not to be confused with Lahiri Mahashaya. I feel like we've all had a moment of confusion and thinking. So we have that to look forward to. I don't really want to say too much because more will be revealed as we journey through together. And I think the joy is in the journey, right? So yeah, we can certainly look forward to his first meeting with this great master and what ensues purely from being in his presence and hearing what he has to say.
Very well
yes.
said. Very well said, Lauren. And also not to be confused with another modern day saint who is named Sri M, who's very popular in India. And Sri M is a disciple of Mahavtar Babaji, and he's got a famous book, Apprentice to a Himalayan Master, which I'm reading. But again, not to be confused by that Sri M as a different M. Even the Master Mahashaya refers to himself as just M because he doesn't want to put too much emphasis on himself. So that's quite nice. So we look forward to that. But I found a very, very nice parallel for us to end on. So as I mentioned, Master Mahashaya has got this book called The Gospel of Ramakrishna Paramahansa, who is his guru and who has actually a lot of, I would say, influence on Guruji and Sri Yukteswar and Hinduism in general, actually, right now from the time where it was back when the British were kind of suppressing it. So there's a book that book is freely available. I'll put a link to it, but it's exceptional. It is exceptional. It's essentially a diary, as I say, just very intimate conversations. And he was with Master Mahashaya was with Ramakrishna Paramahansa on a daily basis. So he would just note everything, and that is a very, very rare thing to have, especially from esteemed souls such as Ramakrishna Paramahansa. So I'll put a link on that, and perhaps you can read that. You can get more inside the mind of Master Mahashaya because he also has conversations with him. So there's a lot, but there's a very beautiful section in it which I've just found, which is very relevant for this chapter that we've just read, and this is linked to everything being alive. We mentioned, Chris and Mike, that it's insane to think that tin, inorganic matter such as tin would have feelings or be alive. But here is a section from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa that sings to that tune, and we'll end it there on that. So Jai Guru, everyone. Thank you, Chris. And if you can read that, and we'll end it there. And we're ending it with Chris reading this because he likes this subject matter a lot.
I've not actually read this before, so I don't know if that's a compliment or an insult. Sri Ramakrishna one day fed a cat with the food that was to be offered to Kali. This was too much for the manager of the temple garden, who considered himself responsible for the proper conduct of the worship. He reported Sri Ramakrishna's insane behavior to Mathur Babu. Sri Ramakrishna has described the incident. The Divine Mother revealed to me in the Kali temple that it was she who had become everything. She showed me that everything was full of consciousness. The image was consciousness, the altar was consciousness, the water vessels were consciousness, the door sill was consciousness, the marble floor was consciousness, all was consciousness. I found everything inside the room soaked, as it were, in bliss, the bliss of God. I saw a wicked man in front of the Kali temple, but in him I also saw the power of the Divine Mother vibrating. That was why I fed the cat with the food that was to be offered to the Divine Mother. I clearly perceived that all this was the Divine Mother, even the cat.